The switchboard hummed with a low, electric pulse that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Outside the reinforced windows of the underground communications center in London, the December rain of 1942 fell in sheets, drumming against the blacked-out city, like 1,000 anxious fingers tapping on glass. Inside, beneath layers of concrete and earth designed to withstand the Luftwaffe's bombs, 23-year-old Margaret Sullivan sat her station, headset pressing against ears that had learned to distinguish between the crackle of a faulty connection and the whisper of something far more dangerous. Margaret had arrived at the subterranean nerve center 2 years earlier, when she was barely 21, fresh from a typing course in Boston, and armed with nothing more than fast fingers and a determination to do something, anything, to help win a war that had already swallowed her older brother somewhere in the Pacific. The recruitment officer in Massachusetts had looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism when she'd volunteered for overseas service. "You want to join the Women's Army Corps?" he'd asked, his Boston accent thick as molasses. "Pretty girl, like you should be thinking about settling down, not running off to a war zone." She'd looked him straight in the eye and said, "My brother's already over there. Someone needs to make sure he has a way to call home." That had been a lie, of course. The real reason was something she couldn't articulate, even to herself. It was a feeling that had seized her the morning after Pearl Harbor, listening to the radio in her family's cramped apartment in Dorchester, while her mother wept into her apron and her father sat stone-faced at the kitchen table. The feeling that the world had cracked open and everything she thought was solid and permanent had revealed itself to be as fragile as spun sugar. The feeling that if she didn't move, didn't act, didn't throw herself into machinery of this terrible moment in history, she would spend the rest of her life wondering if she could have made a difference. So they'd sent her to England, after months of training that transformed her from a secretary who could type 60 words per minute into something else entirely. Something the military didn't quite have a name for. She worked the switchboards, yes, connecting calls between generals and colonels, routing communications across the Atlantic, her fingers dancing across the plugs and jacks with practiced precision. But she also listened. She was trained to listen, to catch the things that shouldn't be there, the patterns that didn't quite fit, the voices that spoke in codes within codes. Most of the other women in her unit treated the work like any other job, punching in their hours, following protocols, grateful to be contributing to the war effort without being shot at. Margaret understood that mentality. She respected it. But from her first week in that underground facility, she'd approached every shift differently. She listened as though lives depended on what she heard, because they did. And if you've ever felt that same pull, that instinct that you're meant for something more than what others see in you, then maybe you understand what kept Margaret at that switchboard night after night, her concentration absolute, her dedication unwavering. If you're someone who believes that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it, then perhaps you'll want to see where this journey leads. Consider staying with us, because Margaret's story is just beginning to unfold, and what she's about to discover will change not just her life, but the course of the war itself. The other women called her Sullivan the Serious, behind her back, though never with cruelty. They'd invite her to pubs on their rare nights off, to the dances where American servicemen and British soldiers competed for their attention with chocolates and cigarettes and promises they couldn't keep. Margaret usually declined, not because she was prudish or unfriendly, but because she couldn't shake the weight of what she knew. Every call she routed, every conversation she monitored, represented human lives hanging in the balance. How could she laugh and flirt and pretend to be a normal 23-year-old girl when she spent her shift listening to casualty reports from North Africa, to the desperate communications from units surrounded in Stalingrad, to the careful, coded discussions of operations that would send thousands of men to their deaths or to victory? Her supervisor, a brittle woman named Lieutenant Patricia Henshaw, who'd been routing military communications since before Margaret was born, had noticed her intensity early on. "You can't save them all, Sullivan," Henshaw had told her after Margaret's first month, when she'd broken protocol to flag what she thought was security breach in a routine supply line communication. It had turned out to be nothing, just a sergeant using sloppy language. "You'll burn yourself out before Christmas if you treat every call like it's the invasion of Normandy." But Margaret hadn't burned out. Instead, she'd gotten sharper, more tuned, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong. The other operators started coming to her when they encountered communications that felt off, trusting her instincts over their own training. Even Lieutenant Henshaw, despite her warnings, began routing the most sensitive intercepts to Margaret Station. It was this reputation that led to the night everything changed. December 18th, 1942, a Friday, though the days of the week had lost most of their meaning in the constant rotation of shifts. Margaret was working the graveyard shift, midnight to 8 in the morning, the time when exhaustion made mistakes more likely and when the enemy knew that Allied vigilance might be at its lowest. The communications center was quieter during these hours, staffed by a skeleton crew. Just Margaret and 3 other operators, Lieutenant Henshaw dozing at her desk with a cold cup of tea growing a skin beside her, and 2 signals intelligence officers playing cards in the break room. The call came through at 3:47 in the morning. Margaret would remember the exact time for the rest of her life, because she just glanced at the clock on the wall, mentally calculating how many more hours until she could stumble back to her bunk and collapse. The board lit up with an incoming connection, routing through a complex series of relays that suggested it originated somewhere in occupied Europe. Not unusual. The resistance networks were constantly trying to communicate with London, sending intelligence, requesting supplies, coordinating operations. Margaret plugged in and heard immediately that something was different about this call. The line quality was too good, for one thing. Resistance communications usually came through on equipment that was barely functional, held together with prayers and borrowed parts. The signal weak and interrupted by German jamming efforts. This connection was crystal clear, the kind of clarity that suggested professional military equipment. German equipment. Her hand hovered over the disconnect, ready to kill the line and report it as a potential enemy probe. But something made her pause. The voices on the other end were speaking German, but it wasn't the rapid-fire exchange of soldiers or the careful, coded language of spies. It was a conversation. Casual, comfortable. 2 men discussing something with the relaxed confidence of people who believe themselves completely secure. Margaret's German was functional, learned during her training, and improved through countless hours of studying intercepted communications. She couldn't pass for a native speaker, but she could understand well enough. And what she was understanding made her blood run cold and hot simultaneously, a feeling like electricity running through her veins. The men were discussing troop movements. Specific units, specific numbers, specific locations. One of them, the older-sounding one with a Prussian accent that spoke of aristocratic military lineage, was laying out a plan for a winter offensive on the Eastern Front. He spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question, referencing divisions and supply lines and strategic objectives with the casual expertise of a man who'd spent his life in warfare. Margaret's training told her to disconnect immediately, to report this to her superiors, to follow the protocols that existed for exactly this kind of situation. But something deeper, the same instinct that had made her volunteer for this work in the first place, told her to keep listening. This wasn't routine communication. This was something bigger. The man with the Prussian accent was speaking about Operation Citadel, a name Margaret didn't recognize, but which clearly meant something significant to the other man on the line, who responded with questions about timing and resources. She pressed the headset harder against her ears, straining to catch every word. The facility around her faded away. There was only the voice, the words, the information pouring to the line like water through her fingers, and her desperate attempt to hold on to every drop. The older man was explaining that the operation was scheduled for the spring, after the winter rains had passed and the ground had dried enough for the panzers to move freely. He spoke about concentrating forces near Kursk, about a pincer movement that would trap the Soviet armies, about how this offensive would break the back of Stalin's resistance and turn the tide on the Eastern Front. Margaret's hand was shaking as she reached for the notepad beside her station. She began writing, her shorthand filling page after page as the conversation continued. The men spoke for 17 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that, time distorting the intensity of her concentration. They discussed logistics, command structures, the concerns of other generals about whether the Wehrmacht had the strength for such an ambitious operation after the disaster at Stalingrad. The younger man, who seemed to be some kind of aide or subordinate officer, raised questions about security, about whether they should be discussing this over an open line. The Prussian-accented man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "This line is secure," he said in German. "The English aren't clever enough to tap into our communications, and even if they were, they wouldn't understand what they were hearing. They think we're finished after Stalingrad. Let them think that. It will make our victory all the sweeter." Then the line went dead, just like that, without warning or ceremony. One moment Margaret was listening to a German general laugh about Allied incompetence, and the next there was only the empty hiss of a disconnected call. She sat frozen for a moment, her mind racing. This was it. This was the kind of intelligence that could change everything. But it was also potentially a trap. The Germans were masters of deception, feeding false information through channels they knew were compromised, leading the Allies into catastrophic mistakes. How could she be sure this was real? How could she know that what she just heard was an elaborate ruse designed to make the Allies concentrate their forces in the wrong place, at the wrong time? "Sullivan?" Lieutenant Henshaw's voice cut through her thoughts. The older woman was standing behind her, no longer dozing, her eyes sharp and alert. "What have you got?" Margaret turned, still clutching her notepad full of shorthand. "Ma'am, I just intercepted what I believe to be a high-level German military communication. They were discussing a major offensive operation plan for the spring of 1943, targeting Kursk on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel, they called it. Specific troop numbers, timing, strategic objectives. Everything." Henshaw's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw something flicker in her eyes. Excitement, maybe, or fear, or both. "You're certain it wasn't just resistance chatter? Sometimes the networks pick up German communications and relay them." "No, ma'am. This was a direct German line. Military quality. And the speaker, he sounded like a general. High-ranking. He had that way of speaking, like he expected the entire world to snap to attention when he opened his mouth." Henshaw took the notepad from Margaret's trembling hands and scanned the pages. Her lips moved slightly as she read, translating the German in her head. When she looked up, her face was grave. "You need to repeat this to the intelligence officers. Right now. And Sullivan..." She paused, her hand on Margaret's shoulder. "If this is what you think it is, if you've actually intercepted a German general discussing operational plans, you may have just done something extraordinary. You may have also put yourself in considerable danger. The Germans will realize their line was compromised. They'll want to know how. They'll want to know who was listening." The next hours passed in a blur of debriefings. Margaret was pulled into a small, windowless room and questioned by a succession of intelligence officers, each more senior than the last. She repeated her story over and over, walking them through every detail of the intercepted call, every word she could remember, every inflection and tone. They were skeptical at first, these men with their press uniforms and their Oxford accents, looking at this American girl who was telling them she just stumbled onto one of the most important pieces of intelligence of the war. But as she spoke, providing details that were too specific to be fabricated, demonstrating her command of German technical vocabulary, explaining the routing of the call, and why it suggested a secure German military line, she watched their skepticism transform into something else. Belief, urgency, and underlying it all, a current of fear. By dawn, Margaret had been ordered to maintain absolute silence about what she'd heard. She was confined to facility, not allowed to return to her regular barracks or to communicate with anyone outside the intelligence unit. The official explanation, given to the other women in her section, was that she was undergoing special training. But Margaret knew the real reason. They were protecting her, yes, but they were also making sure she couldn't compromise the intelligence, accidentally or otherwise. For 3 days, she lived in a strange limbo. She was given a cot in a storage room that had been hastily converted into makeshift quarters. Her meals were brought to her on trays. She wasn't allowed to work her regular shifts, wasn't allowed to do anything except wait while somewhere above her head, in the offices and war rooms where decisions were made. People argued about what to do with the information she provided. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Henshaw came to get her. "Get dressed in your best uniform," she said without preamble. "You're being taken to a meeting. Important people want to talk to you." Important turned out to be an understatement. Margaret found herself in a car with blacked-out windows, driven through London's grey streets to a building she wasn't allowed to identify. Inside, up several flights of stairs, through corridors patrolled by armed guards, into a room where maps covered every wall, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. There were British officers present and Americans, their uniforms decorated with enough ribbons and stars to make Margaret's head spin. And sitting at the head of the table, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts interest and assessment, was a man whose photograph she'd seen in every newspaper, whose voice she heard on the radio rallying the British people through their darkest hours. She was standing 10 feet from Winston Churchill. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice a familiar growl she'd heard through countless broadcasts. "I understand you've been eavesdropping on our German friends. Tell me, do you believe what you heard was genuine?" Margaret's mouth was dry. Every instinct told her to defer to the senior officers in the room, to hedge her answer with qualifications and caveats. But she looked at Churchill, at his bulldog face with an expression of fierce determination, and she thought about her brother somewhere in the Pacific, about all the boys who were fighting and dying, about the responsibility she'd taken on the day she volunteered to serve. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I believe it was genuine. The quality of the line, the technical details they discussed, the way they spoke, everything suggested this was a real military communication between high-ranking German officers. I don't think it was a deception. I think they believed their line was secure and they were speaking freely." Churchill studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "And if you're wrong? If this is a German trap designed to make us waste resources preparing for an offensive that will never come, or worse, to leave us exposed somewhere else while they strike where we're not looking, then I'm wrong, sir," Margaret said quietly. "But I don't think I am. I've been listening to German communications for 2 years. I know how they sound when they're running a deception operation. This wasn't that. This was 2 men having a conversation they believed was private. One of them said something that stuck with me. He said the English weren't clever enough to tap their communications. He was laughing about it. Men don't laugh like that when they're trying to deceive someone. They laugh like that when they feel safe." One of the British intelligence officers, a colonel with a thin mustache and skeptical eyes, spoke up. "With all due respect, Prime Minister, we're basing potentially crucial strategic decisions on the impressions of a telephone operator. A very capable one, I'm sure, but still, this isn't the kind of intelligence we can afford to act on without corroboration." Churchill's gaze didn't leave Margaret. "Tell me something, Miss Sullivan. Why did you volunteer for this work? What brought you here, to London, to sit in a basement and listen to other people's conversations?" It was such an unexpected question that Margaret answered without thinking, without the filter she usually applied to her words. "Because I could not, sir. Because when I heard about Pearl Harbor, when I saw what was happening in the world, I felt like I had 2 choices. I could stay safe and comfortable and spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have made a difference, or I could take a risk. I could try. Even if I failed, even if I never did anything important, at least I would have tried. And then I got here and I realized that this work, sitting at a switchboard and listening, it was exactly what I was meant to do. I'm good at it, sir. I know that sounds arrogant, but it's true. I'm very good at listening, at hearing the things other people miss. And I heard something important. I know I did." The room was silent for a moment after she finished speaking. Then Churchill smiled, a small, almost private expression. "Youth," he said, addressing the room at large. "Youth has this marvelous combination of confidence and humility. They believe they can change the world, and they're just naive enough to try." He turned back to Margaret. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan. You've done well. We'll take your intelligence very seriously. I assure you." Margaret was dismissed after that, escorted out of the room by Lieutenant Henshaw, while the senior officers remained behind to debate and decide. As they walked back down the corridors, Henshaw spoke quietly. "You impressed him. That doesn't happen often. Churchill's seen it all, heard it all, but you managed to make him believe you. That's no small thing. Do you think they'll act on it?" Margaret asked. "The intelligence, I mean, or will they decide it's too risky?" Henshaw shrugged. "Above my pay grade, Sullivan. Above yours, too. All we can do is our jobs. We listen, we report, and we let the people with stars on their shoulders decide what it means. But between you and me, she paused at the top of the stairs, looking at Margaret with an expression that was almost maternal. I've been in this business a long time. I've heard a lot of intercepts, seen a lot of intelligence reports. What you picked up the other night, that was the real thing. I'd stake my career on it. The question is whether the brass will have the courage to believe it. The answer came sooner than Margaret expected. Within a week, she was back at her regular post on the switchboard, the incident apparently forgotten, life returning to its normal rhythm of shifts and sleep and the constant background hum of war. But she noticed changes. There were more intelligence officers around the facility now, and new equipment being installed, more sophisticated recording devices and signal analyzers. The women were given additional training in recognizing German military communications, and the protocols for reporting suspicious intercepts were updated and made more stringent. And then in January of 1943, Margaret was called into Lieutenant Henshaw's office and told she was being reassigned, not to a different post, but to a different role. She would still work the switchboard, but now she'd be part of a special team focused exclusively on intercepting and analyzing German military communications. It was dangerous work. Henshaw explained. If the Germans realized how deeply their communications were compromised, they'd change their protocols, upgrade their security, and the intelligence would dry up. Margaret would be a target if her role was ever discovered, subject to German reprisal and possibly assassination attempts if they managed to identify her. I understand the risks, ma'am, Margaret said, though her stomach was churning at the thought. I want to do it. I need to do it. Henshaw nodded, unsurprised. I thought you'd say that. Sullivan, you're 23 years old. You should be home, safe, maybe married to some nice boy from Boston, thinking about babies and a little house in the suburbs. Instead, you're here, about to become one of the most important intelligence assets the Allies have in this war. Do you ever regret it? The choice you made to come here? Margaret thought about that question, really considered it for the first time since she'd volunteered. Did she regret it? There were moments, late at night when she couldn't sleep, when she thought about the life she'd left behind. The simplicity of it, the predictability. She could have stayed in Boston, found work in an office or a factory supporting the war effort from the safety of home, eventually married and settled down like Henshaw said. But that life felt like a ghost now, something that belonged to a different person, a younger Margaret who hadn't yet discovered what she was capable of. No, ma'am, she said finally. I don't regret it, not even a little bit. Her new role began immediately. Margaret and 3 other women, carefully selected for their language skills and their demonstrated ability to work under pressure, became what the intelligence officers called listeners. They manned a special bank of switchboards equipped with the new recording equipment, monitoring specific frequencies known to be used by German military communications. It was tedious work, hours and hours of listening to static and routine traffic, interspersed with brief moments of terror and excitement when something important came through. But Margaret was good at tedious. She had the patience for it, the ability to maintain absolute concentration, even when nothing was happening. And she had her instincts, those gut feelings that told her when to pay closer attention, when a seemingly routine communication might be masking something more significant. Over the next months, she and her team intercepted dozens of communications. Most were routine, the mundane logistics of an army at war. Supply requests, casualty reports, orders for troop movements that were tactically interesting but not strategically crucial. But occasionally they caught something bigger, a discussion between field commanders about the weakness of their defensive positions, a complaint from a general about the inadequacy of his panzer divisions, a worried exchange about fuel shortages and ammunition supplies. Each piece of intelligence, no matter how small, was meticulously recorded, transcribed, translated, and passed up the chain of command. Margaret never knew what happened to the information after it left her hands. She didn't know if it was being used to plan operations to target bombing raids, to make the 1,000 strategic decisions that determined the course of the war. She just knew that it mattered, that somewhere, someone was reading her reports and acting on them, and that action might save lives, might win battles, might, in some small way, bring this terrible war closer to its end. The work was exhausting in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was mentally draining, emotionally depleting. Every shift was a marathon of concentration, and the knowledge that any lapse, any moment of inattention, might mean missing something crucial weighed on Margaret constantly. She started having dreams about the switchboard, nightmares where calls came through, but she couldn't understand the words, where German generals spoke in riddles and she was supposed to decode them, but couldn't remember how. The other women on her team felt it too. They were all young, all bright, all driven by the same sense of purpose that had brought Margaret to this work. But the strain showed in different ways. One of them, a cheerful girl from Chicago named Dorothy, started losing weight at an alarming rate, her uniforms hanging loose on a frame that seemed to diminish week by week. Another, a serious linguistics professor's daughter named Alice, developed a nervous habit of picking at her fingernails until they bled. The third, Mary, a farm girl from Iowa with a gift for languages, began having panic attacks during shifts, hyperventilating into paper bags while trying to maintain her composure. Lieutenant Henshaw watched over them all with a mixture of concern and ruthless pragmatism. She knew what the work was costing them, but she also knew how important it was. She instituted mandatory rest periods, forced them to take days off even when they protested, brought in a doctor to monitor their health. But she couldn't protect them from the psychological toll, from the weight of knowing that they were hearing the enemy's secrets, that they were engaged in an invisible war where the casualties were measured in stress and sleeplessness, and the slow erosion of the carefree young women they'd once been. Margaret coped by focusing on the mission. Every time she felt herself start to crack, every time the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she thought about her brother in the Pacific, about all the soldiers and sailors and airmen who were risking their lives on the front lines. She was safe comparatively. She was underground, protected by concrete and earth, facing no immediate physical danger. How could she complain about being tired when men were dying in the mud and blood of battlefields she'd never see? But there were moments when the artificiality of that comparison became apparent. Moments when she realized that what she was doing was its own kind of combat, that the war being fought in her head was just as real as the war being fought with bullets and bombs. The enemy she was battling wasn't German soldiers, but her own limitations, her own exhaustion, her own growing sense that she was being consumed by this work, that there was less and less of Margaret Sullivan the person, and more of Margaret Sullivan the intelligence asset. In the spring of 1943, as the weather warmed and the London streets began to shake off the gray pall of winter, Margaret intercepted another communication that would prove crucial. It was April 26th, a Monday, during an afternoon shift. The call came through on a frequency that had been relatively quiet for weeks, a channel they monitored out of routine rather than expectation. The voices were different this time. Not the Prussian general she'd heard back in December, but others, younger men, staff officers by the sound of them, discussing the final preparations for Operation Citadel. They spoke with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. These men who were planning an offensive that would commit hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to a massive gamble on the Eastern Front. Margaret listened and wrote, her shorthand flying across page after page. They discussed the concentration of forces around Kursk, the arrival of new Tiger and Panther tanks, the concerns about Soviet defensive preparations. One of them mentioned that they detected increased Soviet activity in the Kursk salient, fortifications being built, troops being moved into position. He wondered aloud whether the element of surprise had been lost. The other officer dismissed the concern. Even if they know we're coming, he said in German, what can they do? We have the superior tanks, the superior tactics. We'll crush them just as we crushed France in 1940. This will be our greatest victory of the war. But there was doubt in his voice, Margaret noted, a hesitation that undermined the confident words. And in that hesitation, she heard something that filled her with cold certainty. The Germans were going to launch Operation Citadel. The intelligence she'd intercepted back in December hadn't been a deception. It had been real, and now, for months later, the operation was moving forward exactly as that Prussian general had described it. She filed her report with the same attention to detail she always used, but this time she added something extra, a note at the bottom, in her own handwriting, addressed to whoever would read this further up the chain of command. This confirms the December 18th intercept. Operation Citadel is real and imminent. The German officers sound nervous, which suggests they're aware their plans may be compromised but are committed to proceeding anyway. Recommend urgent action to counter this offensive. She didn't know if anyone would read that note. She didn't know if it would make any difference. But she felt compelled to add it, to make sure that someone, somewhere, understood the significance of what she'd heard. What Margaret couldn't know, sitting in her underground facility in London, was that her intelligence had already made an enormous difference. The information she'd intercepted back in December, combined with other intelligence sources, had been passed to the Soviet Union through careful diplomatic channels. Stalin, ever suspicious and paranoid, had initially been skeptical of the intelligence, suspecting it was a Western trick to manipulate Soviet strategy. But as spring arrived and German preparations around Kursk became more obvious, as multiple intelligence sources confirmed the same basic picture, Stalin had been convinced. The Soviets had spent months preparing for Operation Citadel, turning the Kursk salient into one of the most heavily fortified positions in military history. They'd laid millions of mines, dug thousands of miles of trenches, positioned hundreds of artillery batteries and anti-tank guns. They'd concentrated their best armies, their newest tanks, their most experienced commanders, and they'd waited, knowing what was coming, ready to turn the German offensive into a bloodbath that would break the Wehrmacht's back on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk, when it finally began in July of 1943, was the largest tank battle in history. Nearly 3 million men, 7,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft fought across a landscape that had been turned into an industrial-scale killing ground. The Germans attacked with all the fury and skill they could muster, their Tiger and Panther tanks advancing in massive armored wedges, their infantry following behind, their Luftwaffe providing close air support, and they ran headlong into Soviet defenses that had been waiting for them, that knew exactly where they were coming and exactly how to stop them. The battle lasted for weeks, a grinding, brutal affair that consumed men and machines at an appalling rate. In the end, the German offensive broke against Soviet defenses like waves against a cliff. The Wehrmacht suffered casualties it could never replace, lost tanks and aircraft it couldn't rebuild, and most importantly, lost a strategic initiative on the Eastern Front forever. After Kursk, the Germans would never again launch a major offensive in the East. From July 1943 onward, they would only retreat, fighting desperately to slow the Soviet advance but unable to stop it. And Margaret Sullivan, sitting at her switchboard in London, never knowing the full impact of what she'd done, continued to listen, continued to intercept German communications, to file her reports, to do her job with the same meticulous dedication she brought to every shift since her first day in that underground facility. She learned about the Battle of Kursk from the newspapers, like everyone else. Read about the massive Soviet victory, about the turning point on the Eastern Front, about how the Red Army was now pushing west toward Poland and Germany itself. She felt a fierce pride in that victory, a sense that this was what they'd been fighting for, what all the sacrifice and hardship had been leading toward. But she never connected it to her work, never realized that the intelligence she'd intercepted had played a crucial role in that triumph, because that was the nature of intelligence work. She was learning. You did your job, filed your reports, and then let go of the results. You couldn't know the outcome of your efforts, couldn't trace the chain of cause and effect from your switchboard to the battlefields where the war was actually being won or lost. You had to have faith that what you were doing mattered, that someone was listening, that your small contribution was part of a larger picture you'd never see in its entirety. The summer of 1943 brought changes to Margaret's life beyond the work. Her brother James wrote from the Pacific, his letters carefully censored but still managing to convey something of what he was experiencing. He'd been at Guadalcanal, he wrote, though he couldn't tell her much about it except that it had been hot and scary, and I'm glad it's over. He was on a ship now, moving between islands whose names he couldn't mention, doing work he couldn't describe. But he was alive, he was well, and he was proud of her, though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure what she was doing in London beyond something vague involving communications. Whatever it is, he wrote in a letter that arrived in August, I know you're doing it better than anyone else could. You always were the smartest one in the family. Maggie, Mom used to say you had a mind like a steel trap, and I guess the Army figured that out too. Keep doing what you're doing, and stay safe, okay? It would kill Mom if anything happened to you. That letter made Margaret cry, sitting on her narrow cot in her quarters after a 14-hour shift. She cried for her brother, for her mother back home who had both her children in harm's way, for all the families who were waiting and worrying and praying for their loved ones to come home. She cried because she was exhausted and lonely and sometimes doubted whether what she was doing made any difference at all. And then she dried her eyes, washed her face, and went back to work, because that's what you did. You kept going. You did your job. You tried to make a difference, even when you couldn't see the results. As 1943 turned into 1944, the nature of the war began to change. The Allies were winning now, not everywhere and not easily, but winning nonetheless. Italy had surrendered. The Soviets were advancing in the east. And in England, everyone knew something big was coming. The buildup of troops and equipment was impossible to miss. The roads choked with convoys, the skies filled with aircraft, the entire southern coast of England transforming into a massive military encampment. Margaret's work intensified as D-Day approached. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, and their communications reflected a mixture of preparation and panic. She intercepted countless calls about coastal defenses, about troop dispositions, about the desperate German attempts to figure out where and when the Allies would strike. Some of the communications were clearly deceptions. The Germans trying to feed false information through channels they suspected were compromised. But others were genuine, and Margaret and her team worked frantically to separate the truth from the lies. She was at her post on the morning of June 6, 1944, when news of the invasion reached the facility. The mood was electric, a combination of fear and excitement that crackled through the underground corridors. This was it, the moment they'd all been working toward, preparing for, hoping for. Allied troops were storming the beaches of Normandy, fighting their way onto Hitler's fortress Europe, beginning the campaign that would, if it succeeded, bring the war to an end. Margaret's switchboard exploded with activity that day and in the days that followed. German communications went haywire as their forces tried to respond to the invasion, as commanders demanded reinforcements and air support, as the careful defensive plans were thrown into chaos by the reality of Allied military power. She worked shift after shift with barely any break, sustained by coffee and adrenaline, and the knowledge that every piece of intelligence she intercepted, every communication she reported, might help the men fighting on those beaches. One call in particular stuck with her. It came through on June 8th, 2 days after the invasion. A German colonel, his voice tight with stress, speaking to someone at headquarters. He was reporting that his division was being overrun, that Allied forces were pushing inland faster than anyone had anticipated, that they needed reinforcements immediately or the entire defensive line would collapse. The officer on the other end of the line told him, in a voice that was cold and bureaucratic, that no reinforcements were available, that he needed to hold his position with the forces he had. That retreat was not an option. The colonel's response was a bitter laugh. "Hold with what?" he said in German. "Half my men are dead or wounded. We have no air cover, no armor support, no ammunition. You're asking me to hold against an ocean with a paper wall. This is madness." "Those are the Führer's orders," the bureaucrat replied. "Hold or be shot for desertion. Those are your choices." The line went dead after that, and Margaret sat staring at her switchboard, feeling a complex mixture of triumph and pity. Triumph because this was evidence of German desperation, proof that the invasion was succeeding. Pity because she just heard a man being ordered to his death, told to fight a hopeless battle because the alternative was execution. Whatever else the Germans were, however evil their cause, they were still human beings, caught in machinery of a war that was grinding them up just as surely as it was grinding up Allied soldiers. That moment crystallized something for Margaret. The war wasn't black and white, good versus evil in some simple, straightforward way. It was complicated and messy and full of suffering on all sides. Yes, the Allies were fighting a just cause. Yes, defeating Nazi Germany was necessary and right. But that didn't make the cost any less terrible, didn't make the death and destruction any less tragic. Victory when it came, would be purchased with an ocean of blood, and no amount of justification could make that ocean any less red. The summer and fall of 1944 brought a series of Allied victories that seemed, finally, to promise an end to the war. Paris was liberated in August, a moment that brought tears of joy to everyone in the London facility. The Soviets continued their relentless advance in the east, pushing through Poland toward Germany itself. The Germans were being crushed between two massive Allied armies, and their communications reflected their growing desperation. But the war wasn't over yet. In December 1944, the Germans launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes, the attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a last desperate gamble, throwing their remaining reserves into an attack designed to split the Allied armies and buy time for Germany. And for a few terrifying weeks, it looked like it might succeed. Margaret was back at her switchboard when the first indications of the offensive came through. German communications that suggested major troop movements, references to an operation that didn't fit any of the known German defensive preparations. She flagged it immediately, sent urgent reports up the chain, but the intelligence was fragmentary, incomplete. By the time the full picture became clear, the German attack was already underway, and Allied forces were reeling back in surprise and confusion. The next month was perhaps the most intense of Margaret's entire war. She worked endless shifts, trying to intercept any intelligence that might help counter the German offensive, listening to the desperate communications of German commanders who knew this was their last chance, their final roll of the dice. She heard them celebrating early victories, taking ground, capturing supplies. And then she heard the tide turn, heard the desperation creep back into their voices, as the Allied response mobilized, as superior numbers and industrial capacity began to tell. By January of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over, the German offensive broken, their last reserves expended in a gamble that had failed. And now there was nothing between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany except distance and time. Margaret's role in the war began to wind down as the spring of 1945 approached, with the Germans in full retreat. Their communications became less frequent and less revealing. The intelligence work shifted from trying to anticipate enemy operations to tracking the collapse of the German military, monitoring the desperate attempts to organize a defense, listening to the recriminations and blame and desperate denial as the Third Reich crumbled. She was at her post on May 8, 1945, when the announcement came through that Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Around her, the other women in the facility were crying, laughing, embracing each other in relief and joy. Someone had brought in a bottle of champagne, contraband carefully hidden for just this moment, and they were passing around, drinking straight from the bottle, not caring about regulations or protocol, because what did any of that matter anymore? They'd won. After 6 years of war, after millions of deaths, after suffering beyond calculation, they'd won. Margaret should have felt joy, should have felt the same relief and triumph that was radiating from everyone around her, but instead, she felt strangely empty, numb. She'd spent 3 years of her life in this underground facility, listening to other people's conversations, filing reports, doing work that had consumed every ounce of her energy and dedication. And now it was over, just like that. The war she'd shaped her entire adult life around had ended, and she didn't know who she was supposed to be now that it was done. Lieutenant Henshaw found her sitting alone in a corner, watching the celebration with an expression that must have revealed her confusion. The older woman sat down beside her, not speaking for a moment, just sharing the space. Finally, she said, "It's hard, isn't it? The ending. Everyone thinks it should be this moment of pure joy, and for some people it is. But for people like us who've been doing this work, it feels more complicated than that." "I should be happy," Margaret said quietly. "My brother's alive. He'll come home now. The war's over. We won. But I just feel, I don't know, lost maybe." "You're grieving," Henshaw said gently. "Grieving for the person you were before all this, for the years you spent here, for the simplicity of having a clear purpose. War is terrible, but it's also clarifying. You know what you're supposed to do, what you're fighting for. Peace is harder. You have to figure out who you want to be and what you want to do with your life. And there's no enemy to orient yourself against, no clear mission to complete. It's just you and your choices and an open future. That's terrifying in its own way. Margaret nodded, understanding. What do I do now? I can't imagine going back to being a secretary in Boston. I can't imagine living that kind of ordinary life after this. But I also don't know what else there is. You'll figure it out, Henshaw assured her. You're smart, capable, and you've proven you can handle extraordinary pressure. The world needs people like you, Sullivan. Maybe not for war anymore, thank God, but for all the work of building a better peace. Intelligence work won't stop just because the shooting has. There will still be threats, still be enemies, still be a need for people who can listen and understand and put the pieces together. If you want to keep doing this work, there will be opportunities. Or, if you want to do something completely different, you'll be brilliant at that too. You get to choose. That's the gift of peace. You get to decide who you want to be. The weeks following the German surrender were strange and transitional. The facility in London began to wind down its operations, the urgent wartime mission replaced by the slower work of occupation and reconstruction. Margaret was offered a position with the newly forming intelligence services, the organizations that would become the CIA and other Cold War agencies. They wanted her skills, her experience, her proven ability to work under pressure and extract meaning from fragmentary information. She considered the offer seriously. Part of her wanted to continue to work, to keep doing what she becomes so good at. But another part of her, the part that had been dormant for 3 years, wanted something different, wanted a life that wasn't spent in underground facilities listening to other people's secrets, wanted to see the sun, to live in the open world, to discover who Margaret Sullivan could be when she wasn't at war. In the end, she declined the intelligence position and accepted a different offer, one that surprised everyone, including herself. She took a job with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, helping to coordinate aid efforts in devastated European cities. It was work that used her organizational skills, her ability to manage complex logistics and communications. But instead of contributing to the machinery of war, she'd be contributing to the work of healing. Her last day at the London facility was in July of 1945. Lieutenant Henshaw organized a small farewell gathering, just the women from Margaret's team and a few of the intelligence officers who'd worked with them over the years. There were no speeches, no official recognition. The work they'd done was still classified and would remain so for decades. They couldn't talk about it, couldn't share it with their families or friends, couldn't seek recognition or thanks for what they'd accomplished. But they knew what they'd done, what they contributed, how many lives they'd saved through their vigilance and skill. And that knowledge, private and quiet and held close to the heart, was enough. It had to be enough. Dorothy, the girl from Chicago, had gained back some of the weight she'd lost and was planning to go to college on the GI Bill, study journalism, maybe write about the war from a woman's perspective. Alice, the professor's daughter, was returning to academia, go to work on her doctorate in linguistics, analyzing the ways language had been used as a weapon during the war. Mary, the farm girl from Iowa, was going home to help her family rebuild their operation, and maybe, she said with a shy smile, marry the boy from the neighboring farm who'd written her faithfully through all her time overseas. And Margaret was going to Europe, to cities that had been bombed into rubble, to help feed and house and heal people who'd survived horrors she could barely imagine. It felt right, somehow, a way to balance the scales, to offer help instead of gathering intelligence, to build instead of observing destruction. As she packed her few belongings, preparing to leave London for the last time, Margaret found the notepad she'd used that December night in 1942, the one where she'd first recorded the intelligence about Operation Citadel. She'd kept it, against regulations, unable to throw away the evidence of that moment that had changed everything. She flipped through the pages, looking at her hasty shorthand, remembering the feeling of listening to that Prussian accented general, the certainty that what she was hearing was important. She never knew the full impact of that intercept, never knew that her intelligence had been passed to the Soviets, that it had helped prepare them for the Battle of Kursk, that it had contributed to one of the most decisive victories of the war. The knowledge was still classified, the connection still secret. All she knew was that she'd done her job, had listened carefully, had reported faithfully. Whether that mattered or not, she'd tried her best. She'd shown up every day and done the work and trusted that it meant something. That, in the end, was all anyone could do. Show up, do the work, trust that in some way, large or small, your efforts mattered. That the world was a little better because you'd been in it, because you tried, because you'd refused to be just a telephone girl when the moment demanded you be something more. Margaret Sullivan left London on a gray morning in late July, catching a military transport to Brussels, and then onward to Vienna, where she'd be working with displaced persons camps. She looked back at the city as it receded behind her, at the streets she'd walked during her brief times above ground, at the skyline that bore the scars of the Blitz. She'd spent 3 years in that city, and yet she lived most of her life underground, in artificial light, connected to the world only through the voices that traveled through her headphones. Now she was going to live in the light again. She was going to work with real people, not disembodied voices. She was going to help rebuild instead of listening to destruction. And maybe in time, she'd figure out who Margaret Sullivan was supposed to be in peacetime, who that young woman from Boston could become, now that the war that had defined her was over. Years later, long after the war, after the classified files were declassified and historians began piecing together the full story of Allied intelligence operations, a researcher would discover Margaret's reports in archives. He'd traced the intelligence about Operation Citadel from her original intercept through the chain of command, through the diplomatic channels that passed it to the Soviets, all the way to the battles at Kursk, where it had helped shape one of the most important victories of World War II. He'd write a paper about it, give Margaret Sullivan credit for her role in that victory. By then, she'd be an old woman, living quietly in a small town in Massachusetts, her wartime service a distant memory. When the researcher contacted her, asking for an interview about her work, she'd be surprised that anyone remembered, that anyone cared about what a telephone girl had done in a basement in London more than half a century ago. "I was just doing my job," she'd tell him. The same thing she'd told herself every day during the war. "I wasn't special. I just listened carefully and reported what I heard. Anyone could have done it." But that wasn't true, and the researcher knew it. Not anyone could have done it. Not anyone could have maintained that level of concentration, that dedication, that instinct for what was important. Not anyone could have been Margaret Sullivan, sitting at a switchboard in the depth of World War II, intercepting the secrets that would help win the war. She'd been called just a telephone girl by the people who didn't know better, who couldn't see past the surface to understand what she was really doing. But she'd never let that diminish her, never let it make her feel less important or less capable. She'd known her value, known her contribution, and she'd done the work anyway, without recognition, without thanks, because it needed to be done and because she could do it better than almost anyone else. That was heroism, the researcher would write in his paper. Not the obvious heroism of soldiers storming beaches or pilots flying into battle, but the quiet, persistent heroism of showing up every day and doing difficult work without glory or recognition, trusting that it mattered even when you couldn't see the results. The heroism of intelligence, of patience, of dedication to a cause greater than yourself. Margaret Sullivan, telephone operator turned intelligence analyst, had possessed that kind of heroism. She'd sat at her switchboard and listened to the enemy's secrets, and in doing so, she'd helped save countless lives and win a war. And if you stayed with her story all the way to this moment, if you followed her journey from that young woman in Boston who volunteered because she couldn't not, to the vital intelligence asset who changed the course of history, then perhaps you understand what she represented. The power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. The importance of dedication, skill, and the willingness to serve something larger than yourself. If her story resonated with you, if you felt connected to her struggles and triumphs, consider joining others who appreciate these glimpses into the hidden corners of history. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with Margaret until the end," to let me know you made it through her entire journey. And if you found value in this deep dive into one woman's war, a simple like would mean the world, and help others discover these stories too. There are so many more tales like Margaret's waiting to be told. Stories of women whose contributions have been forgotten or overlooked, whose quiet heroism deserves to be remembered. Stay with me as we continue to uncover these hidden histories, these voices that have been silent for too long. The next story is waiting, and I think you'll find it just as powerful as Margaret's.